we can always go back to January 6th and ask why weren't the National Guard called in then when police officers were being attacked.
I can tell you why. Hold on. I can tell you why. Go back to Nancy Pelosi's own words.
The president had an opportunity.
Because I think you're an honest man. Hold on. I want to go on first. True or false? Did they say to Nancy Pelosi that if you want to go ahead and bring in the National Guard and others, we will more than happy do that? And Nancy Pelosi was the one that said no.
The president
fanned
the flames in
True or false?
January 6th?
Yes. Beforehand, they said, we will give you the resources before January 6th, and she said no.
Guys, everybody, just 1 second. Let me just get everybody one at a time.
Am I right?
I want John to just answer that quick question.
The Capitol Police went to the architect of the Capitol and the sergeant at arms from both houses. The chief of the Capitol Police does not know who they went to, but let's assume they went to their political leadership.
Pelosi said this.
And
that's what she said.
And that they said they didn't want the National Guard brought in. They wanted them on standby. The day of the riot, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are on the phone saying, can we get the National Guard?
Boy. So we got to talk about the mainstream liberal media, the Democrats, and the new narrative that they're putting out there about who's at fault for the LA riots, okay? Because Democrats, instead of taking responsibility and accountability for the lunatics in their party and the illegal immigrants who they want to keep in the country in order to wipe their asses, committing acts of domestic terrorism, no, they turn around and they blame Trump. They point the finger at President Trump. And again, the new talking point is that, well, it is Trump's fault because the National Guard, the Marines, the military being in LA, that triggered the far left radical domestic terrorists, right? That triggered them, right? And therefore, it is Trump's fault that the mass violence and chaos is happening. I want you guys to understand, they're trying to have it both ways. They try to say that it's not any violence and chaos happening, right? That's a right-wing conspiracy, right? So they deny that any type of violence is happening. But then when they acknowledge that violence is happening, they say, well, that's Trump's fault, again, for calling in the National Guard, in the Marines, in the military.
I do want to go back and say that, just go back in time a minute. On Thursday of last week, Los Angeles was peaceful. There was nothing going on here that warranted the federal intervention that took place the very next day. If we want to look at the cause of what is happening here, I take it back to raids that took place on Friday and the uncertainty and the fear and the fact that families across the city are terrified that they don't know if they should go to work. They don't know if they should go to school. We have people that were detained. We don't even know the exact numbers of the people that were detained. We have people that have not had contact with legal representation, nor have they even had contact with their families. And so there is an awful lot of concern. When the administration started, they said that this was about crime. They were going to go after violent felons, drug dealers, and I don't know how that matches with the scenes that we saw of people in Home Depot running through the parking lot because they were afraid that they were going to get arrested.
The Pentagon has deployed 700 U.S. Marines to the protests of ICE raids in Los Angeles. They will be joining the 4,000 National Guardsmen already on the ground. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said it's in response to the escalating attacks on law enforcement agents and property damage. But are people getting a much different view of what's going on in LA depending on where they're watching this play out? Because it's quite different when you're talking to people in LA. Yeah. And very different than what you're seeing on the news.
Did you speak to people? Have you spoken to people in LA?
My whole family's in LA.
What did they say?
They're saying, people are mad. It's been peaceful for days. And then suddenly these guys showed up and flipped everybody out.
Yeah, I heard.
So that's what my family is saying.
I heard the same thing. I spoke to about 5 people that live in LA, that work in LA, and they said that these protests were very, very orderly. They weren't violent, and they occurred in about a 4-block radius. Mm-hmm. And we all know how large LA is. And so, in my view, there is no crisis in Los Angeles that ICE did not cause. That is the fact of the matter, right?
Looks like that.
We now know that Stephen Miller ordered his order that they arrest 3,000 people a day, that ICE arrests 3,000 people a day, led to this. And what I will also say is, you know, California is the largest economy in the United States, has the largest economy. And it has sort of it's the largest state, and it has a GDP that's larger than many countries. And so I think we have to look at what's happening from a bird's eye perspective and look at the why. Trump is militarizing that state as a test run to make sure that he can do it in places like New York, that he can do it in other sanctuary cities. And so there is a plan to this, in my view. Mm-hmm. And I really think that there's no question that the LAPD, that has 9,000 police officers, could have handled this quite well, but instead of sending in 7,000, 4,700.
I think that's very astute.
This is where I put a little bit of onus on Governor Newsom. Show that you have the police force to stop the unrest and that it is completely unnecessary to have the National Guard there, to have U.S. troops there, because you can't deny the imagery that you're seeing. There are cars being lit on fire. There are police officers being attacked. There are guardsmen being attacked.
Though?
So to be honest, I don't really care. If you're hurting police officers, if you're damaging property, that you should get your day in court for.
But nothing was happening like that until they sent
But this is where it's on the governor to say, let's make this the biggest peaceful protest in history. But the second it gets violent, the governor needs to crack down and show he's capable.
That was saying there's a lot of things going wrong here. And it dates back even to when California became a sanctuary place, that when there are sanctuary cities, it forces ICE and a lot of the law enforcement to go into the communities. So it almost puts the communities at unrest. And she was saying there's a lot of things here. Obviously, it was exacerbated when the National Guard was sent in. It also shows a disconnect in communication. Federal, when they call in, it should be working with the governor, not separately from the governor, in order to take care of the people on the ground. Yeah. So I would say that there's a lot of things going on here, but none of it should be partisan. And this is why I say either we're for the idea of justice, and when people are looting or there is any violence, they should be punished. Or we're going to release January 6th insurrectionists. Yeah. We're doing one or the other because it should be consistent across the board.
Yeah, so you seen that, you heard that, okay? Like I said, the narrative here from the propagandists, at least some of them in the mainstream liberal media, is that, well, again, this is ICE's fault, right? This is Trump's fault. This is the National Guard's fault, right? They triggered the extremists, okay? And you can't blame the extremists for being triggered and committing acts of domestic terrorism. No, you got to blame ICE, who is just there to enforce federal laws. Now, you know, what's funny about this is that Sarah Haynes had a brief moment of common sense in which she acknowledged that, yeah, a lot of this has to do with the sanctuary city laws that prohibit local law enforcement from cooperating with federal law enforcement. And when that happens, federal law enforcement has to go into these neighborhoods and they have to conduct these operations. And that leads to miscommunication. It leads to confusion. And in some cases, again, chaos, because you have individuals, independent law enforcement agencies that are not cooperating or communicating with each other, right? This whole sanctuary city policy thing is really the reason why a lot of this is happening. Again, on top of the fact that the individuals who are committing the acts of violence, they're also accountable because, again, there's just no excuse for that whatsoever. But again, if you want to look at the root cause of the issue here, why is it that ICE has to go into these neighborhoods? Why they got to go into a Home Depot, right? Why they have to do that? Well, it's because the local law enforcement, they can't cooperate due to the sanctuary city laws. Does that mean that the federal government should stop enforcing federal law because the states and the local cities don't want to cooperate? No, that's not what it means. It just means that the feds got to do it themselves. And if the feds got to do it themselves, then, hey, that's the fault of the Democrats, right? That is who should be taking the blame and taking accountability for what happened. But no. Democrats are not doing that. In fact, again, they are pointing the finger at Trump. In fact, you have Nancy Pelosi. She is now lashing out about this. And she is crying about January 6th, right? She's boohoo, whining, crying over President Trump deploying the National Guard to L.A., but according to her, it's his fault that the National Guard wasn't there on January 6th, even though we have video evidence in which Nancy Pelosi admits otherwise. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into Nancy Pelosi's outrage here.
The president has said he can't send in the Guard without the governor's agreement, permission. the president has said, I don't know if I have to obey the Constitution. I hope the president would read Article 10 of the Constitution, and I urge all of you to do that as well, because Section 12046 of Article 10 says that the National Guard cannot be called up by the president without the consent of the governor. So that is the basis under which he's proceeding. That is the basis on which the governor of California is suing. Really, I think it's really important for people to know how this came to be. Raids that they were holding, situations where if your case is not settled, if you're still out there and haven't had a resolution of your status, you have to, by law, report in on a regular basis. You are obeying the law. And now they are deporting people for obeying the law. So as others have said, it's a distraction. It's really stupid, because we understand that we are a nation of immigrants. We want people to have a facilitation of their status. We do not want any violent protest, and that would be addressed for those who are acting violently. I do want to say two more things. One is, and I say this as a former party chair, when there is a large gathering of people, the anarchists see it as an opportunity and they move in. So always have to be careful whether you see a burned car or broken window or whatever it is. It may be the exuberance of the moment, but it may be the anarchist setting in. I heard one of the former police chiefs of Los Angeles speak about this on Sunday. Secondly, and you know this to be true, and I haven't seen it really reflected so much in the press, in a bipartisan way, on January 6th, with violence against the Constitution, against the Congress, and against the United States Capitol, we begged the President of the United States to send in the National Guard. He would not do it. Not only would he not do it, when law enforcement people were being harmed, some later died, he would not send it in when an insurrection that he incited was causing damage to those assigned to protect the Capitol and the Constitution that day, to accept the results of the Electoral College. That day, he didn't do it. He forgave those people. Now his people want to raise money for them, and yet, in a contra-constitutional way, he has sent the National Guard into California. Something is very wrong with this picture. Inconsistent in his actions, contrary to his own statement that he couldn't, of a year ago, that he couldn't send anyone in without the governor's consent, any place, and in violation of the Constitution. Thank you again, Mr. Gomez.
Yeah, so again, this is really funny to me because Nancy Pelosi, once again, is blaming Trump for problems clearly caused by the Democrat Party, okay? And she's bringing up January 6th, talking about how it's Trump's fault that the National Guard were not deployed that day, except there's video footage of Nancy Pelosi taking responsibility and admitting that it is in fact her fault for why the National Guard was not prepared for what happened on January 6th. It's on camera. We have the footage. Roll the clip.
We have responsibility, Terry. We did not have any accountability for what was going on there, and we should have. This is ridiculous. You're going to ask me in the middle of the thing when they've already breached the inaugural stuff that should we call the Capitol Police? I mean the National Guard? Why weren't the National Guard there to begin with?
They thought that they had sufficient
No,
resources.
there's not a question of how they had been. They don't know. They clearly didn't know, and I take responsibility for not having them just prepare for more.
Yeah, so once again, we have Democrats engaged in revisionist history, pretending as if it is not their fault that the National Guard wasn't deployed to be in D.C. on January 6th when Nancy Pelosi, on camera, on videotape, took responsibility for the National Guard not being there because they worked to undermine the president. They were afraid that President Trump would use the National Guard in order to try to overturn the election. And this is why the powers that be, including Nancy Pelosi, did not want the National Guard there, even though President Trump asked for the National Guard. Again, the Democrats stopped that from happening. They undermined the president due to the fact that they were afraid that President Trump would weaponize the National Guard against the politicians, right? That is what happened. It is the Democrats' fault. And Nancy Pelosi is trying to pretend as if, it is President Trump's fault. But in this case of the National Guard being deployed to L.A., you have these Democrats suing, right? They're suing, and that kind of brings up a very interesting question about the legalities of what President Trump is doing, because essentially what Democrats are doing is that they're setting a precedent that, well, the president should not be able to deploy the National Guard, even if we allow chaos and destruction that endangers federal law enforcement, right? That is essentially what Democrats are suing for, right? For the right of states to not protect their own property, their own citizens, or federal law enforcement who are simply doing their jobs. And that is the whole point of the National Guard being in LA and the military, is to protect federal law enforcement, which again is something that the states and the local law enforcement, they're not doing adequately. But again, this is a legal gray area. Take a look.
There's a lawsuit now.
Yes.
From Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, against the Trump administration for the deployment of this National Guard. You ran on the set a few minutes ago with it in your hand saying, I've read it.
Yes.
What does it say?
So the lawsuit just dropped. So let me lay this out. The law that the Trump administration is using to deploy the National Guard says this. It says the president has the power to deploy the National Guard to a state in any of three circumstances. First of all, if there's an invasion or a danger of invasion. That's not in play here. Second of all, if there's a rebellion or danger of rebellion. Trump did cite that in his order. And then third, a sort of catch-all, if the president is unable with regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. Trump cited that as well. The catch, and this is what California in their lawsuit really seizes on, there's language at the end that says orders for these purposes, deploying the National Guard, shall be issued through the governors of the state. So the main argument California makes in this lawsuit is, well, this was not issued through the governor, through Gavin Newsom. This was Donald Trump directly to the National Guard. Now, I can tell you what the response is going to be. We haven't seen it yet, but the Trump administration is going to say that's just a technicality. It's really the president's call, and there's no way this law intends to say that the governor can essentially override or cancel the president's order. And I'll tell you what the answer is. The answer is we don't know. Because this particular statute has only ever been invoked one prior time in American history. There have been other incidents of the Insurrection Act. That's not what we're talking about here. This specific lawsuit was only invoked once. It was in 1970, and it involved a postal worker strike where Richard Nixon deputized the National Guard to deliver the mail. So a very different scenario. That one didn't even go to the court. So we are really in unknown territory here.
Yeah, so it is a interesting thought experiment, right, in regards to this lawsuit and what it means. Because like I said, what happens in a situation, kind of like this situation, where the states have essentially decided that we're going to allow anarchy and chaos, right? Anarchy and chaos that puts federal law enforcement in danger, a.k.a. ICE. Is the president not allowed to protect federal law enforcement, to allow them to do their jobs? Okay, are states just allowed to not take care of the violence and chaos and the destruction that's happening in their own cities? Again, even if it puts federal law enforcement in danger. Yeah, this is definitely a legal question that needs to be worked out, okay? Because I can see some serious loopholes, again, in the year 2025. And again, really, it shouldn't be like this, because you would think that we wouldn't live in a world where Democrat governors would allow anarchy and chaos for political reasons, but that's where we're at. They're allowing anarchy and chaos and violence for political reasons. In fact, I'll go as far as to say, not only are they allowing it for political reasons, they are complicit in it, right? They're engaged in the domestic terrorism.
What's going on in Los Angeles? What do you make of it?
Well, I'm also a member of the California State Assembly, so I am receiving updates as they come in, and it is an absolute violent mess. Gavin Newsom and California Democrats are singularly responsible for the mayhem that's broken out in California because, number one, they incited it. They took to social media last week on Friday when ICE conducted their raids to, remember, let's be clear, as Jason just said, arrest criminals, some of the worst criminals, sex offenders, rapists, people with violent crimes, assault perpetrators. All of these violent criminals were being rounded up by ICE, not just people here without immigration status. We're talking about real criminals. And what they did is they said that we all needed to take to the streets. So Newsom, Karen Bass, Democrat politicians called on people to go to the streets. Second, they fund the organizations that are organizing these protests. We found over $34 million went to the Coalition for Immigrant Humane Rights in Los Angeles, $34 million in state taxpayer money. And they're the lead organization, not only organizing these protests, but they run a hotline telling people where the ICE agents are and where they should be deploying to. So they're basically giving people their assignments as to where they're to show up and to attack ICE agents. And then finally, they try to shift the blame to Donald Trump. This blame is uniquely at the feet of Gavin Newsom, Karen Bass, and the other Democrats that have created a complete mess out here with their sanctuary state policies and actually have had a very heavy hand in organizing these protests. We even found politicians from the state assembly participating in these protests and urging people to get more aggressive. A member of the LA City Council said that Democrats would be able to organize and be resilient and change up their tactics to stop ICE terrorists. Yeah. This sort of rhetoric needs to stop because it only inflames the tensions out here.
And essentially what they're arguing is that, well, the president should not be able to stop that, right, to step in and enforce the law or to protect federal law enforcement. So, yeah, this will be an interesting lawsuit to follow. Regardless, President Trump is delivering more bad news to Democrats who thought that he would fold, right, which is that he's not folding. He's actually planning to expand his operation across the country. So what you saw happen in L.A. Could very well happen across the country. And if that is the case, yeah, buckle up, right? We're in for a very, very, very fascinating next probably 3 or 4 months. Take a look.
Mr. President, these protests obviously started in reaction to these large-scale ICE operations in Los Angeles. Should people expect to see similar operations in the rest of the country? Yeah. And will similar protests see similar response?
As you know, we're moving murderers out of our country that were put here by Biden or the auto pen. The auto pen really did. I mean, the people, whether it's Lisa Monaco or whoever operated the auto pen, these are criminals. The people are criminals that allowed these criminals into our country. And I don't think that Biden knew what the hell he was doing. I don't think he even knew about it. But when they opened up our borders for the whole world to come in, yeah, we're going to get them out. We're getting them out. We're starting to get acknowledgement from the courts that, you know, as a system. They come in without courts and they go out. They want trials and everything else. I think that's starting to work out now. Judges are starting to see what a terrible situation it is. Many of those people that you saw on television last night are criminals that were allowed into our country by Biden, and they want to stay, and we don't want them. And they come from jails, and they come from mental institutions, and they come from all over the world, not just South America. And we're not going to let them stay. And this is the first, perhaps, of many, or perhaps, you know, if we didn't attack this one very strongly, you'd have them all over the country. But I can inform the rest of the country that when they do it, if they do it, they're going to be met with equal or greater force than we met right here. We did a great job. The people, you, Christy, and Tom Homan, and all.
Yeah, I agree. The Trump administration is doing a great job. The outrage from the Democrats is a sign they're doing a great job. And yeah, this is something that should happen all over the country in regards to the ICE operations. And if these individuals want to continue to commit acts of domestic terrorism, then ultimately at the end of the day, they will be met with equal or greater force, okay? And it's about time for Democrats to start getting arrested, right? The ringleaders of all this. Because let's be real, the real cause is the Democrat Party. They are complicit in the domestic terrorism, and they should be arrested, right? I'm so serious because they're allowing it, okay? They're funding it. They're supporting it. They're helping coordinate the attacks against federal law enforcement. Again, this is a full-blown insurrection, right? This is an insurrection against the federal government, and it must be stopped. And Democrats must be held accountable. So, again, we're going to see what happens over the next few months. Like I told you guys, if President Trump does escalate the activities, which I don't see why he wouldn't. I mean, he's winning the PR battle here. If he does, then, yeah, this could be a very, very, very interesting next 3 or 4 months. So, again, we're going to see. If Democrats decide that they want to side with domestic terrorism, I think that that's not going to end well for them, especially coming up in the midterms. So let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.